Hello, this is Christina Wallace. This is going to be a very short intro, just really to put a face to a voice. And I hope you enjoy my comprehensive introduction to flower making tools and equipment. There was too much to photograph here for the equipment picture, so the full list in the description, please see it. And these are my latest flowers, a tutorial on how to make them next week. Stay tuned and let's get started. Okay, you must excuse me, I have a bit of a cold, so I sound croaky. Anyway, if you're serious about making flowers out of gum paste, get yourself a green board. I find that the little green board is much more comfortable because it's more mobile and easier to kind of get around with, and petals only get so large. So this is the thing I use to grease the board before starting to roll out my petals. You could just use margarine or something. It needs to be vegetable based though. The next thing you would need is rolling pins. The one on the right is just a general rolling pin, and the one on the left is a cell pin. I think this is a large size. And these are my two preferences. I pretty much got away without buying any more for as long as I've been making flowers. So the next thing you would need is something to dust your paste with. I use self-made paste and I leave it on the sticky side because I think it works better and lasts longer. So this is my corn flour, and it's in like a thick stocking, and it looks really ugly. So for that reason I resisted doing it, putting it in a stocking for ages, and actually it does work better because it disperses your dusting more evenly and leaves less patches on a colourful paste. So do try both options before saying, oh no, I don't like the way it looks. Some people prefer to use icing sugar instead of a corn flour. It kind of does the same thing. I just prefer the texture of corn flour. If you plan to wire your petals, which kind of produces the most beautiful flowers generally, you might want to use one of those veining boards, and basically for larger petals you use larger grooves, and for smaller ones you use smaller ones. There is also a method of wiring your petals etc. without using this board, but I'm not going to go into it in much detail in this video. This is a little example of how to make a leaf using this board. So the next one in our show is a foam pad. Before you even get as far as wiring, you might want to thin your petals to make them look really nice. And these foam pads come in different makes, and I've tried a few of them and I really didn't get on with some of them, like couldn't do it. So if you don't get on with yours, then try a different make. It might work better for you. Now this one is kind of soft and quite padded. I think it's Wilton. I don't remember, I had it for years. Anyway, so and the next tool is this little set of bowl tools. They all come in different sizes. They used to be very expensive, but so now they're very cheap, fortunately. You have to dust it before using it, and this large one is to straighten and thin down your petals, and the little ones are better for kind of curving and curling your petals up, just like this. So and actually you'd think that they're metal so they would be invincible, but they're not, because one of them is actually scratched, and it makes my life really difficult. I don't know how it got scratched. It's metal, like I said, but anyway, I need to replace it. So yeah, look after your equipment. Bowl tools, they must. And here's a little tip on using a large bowl tool. If you only have one cutter but need leaves or petals of different sizes, you might find that you want to roll your paste thicker and then stretch your item out, making it wider or longer with a bowl tool, and then leave the other ones original size or slightly smaller. I hope that makes sense. So the next one is a tremendously important tool in sugarcraft. It's called Dresden Tool, and these two are by different companies. in fact, the yellow one might not be actually called Dresden Tool, but and is subtly more different from the black one, and I find it more useful just in the little things that it could do in its shape. But either way, just trust me on this one. Yellow or black one, or preferably both, you need to have them if you're serious about Sugarcraft. They're fantastic tools. So I want to say a couple of more words about this cell pin. As I said, this is a large one, and this is how you may possibly use this pointy end, by making holes in your nearly ready flower or indentations to insert the wire and make it look realistic. This is another version of it, just to give your indentation slightly different shape. So as you could see, the tools, they could be quite interchangeable, and then it just comes to your preference. So while some of the tools are really cheap, so you might just have them as spares in case you lose your main tool. See, you could use this cell pin to kind of as a ball tool in effect. So yeah, it's nice to have doubles of tools, but you also have to be mindful and realize that they are interchangeable, and you don't want to waste your money before you actually get into this whole flower making and realize that, you know, it's there to stay. Another handy little tool is this little cutting wheel. It looks a bit flimsy, but it's actually quite brilliant. And the reason why it's so good is sometimes you might want to do an unusual flower, and you would cut out a cardboard template of it, and then you could just trace it with this nippy little tool and cut out your unusual shape, because sometimes it really isn't worth buying a cutter for something that you would only possibly make once, or or you just come up with your own fantasy flower design, who knows. And that also applies beyond flowers as well. And this thing is fairly obvious. Basically, it's cutters and it's veiners, and there are immense makes of them on the market. This particular one for orchid is by Kitchen Squires, and I find them very good. I find that picking and choosing between different companies is a good idea, because in my experience, not one company got it right with both cutters and veiners on every single occasion. Another question that often crops up is whether to use plastic or metal cutters. The simple answer here would be, if you just work with fondant, then plastic. If you work with gum paste, then mostly metal. However, sometimes you find that the decision is taken out of your hands. For example, a daisy cutter is used for a variety of beautiful flowers, and yet you would be hard pushed trying to find one in different sizes in metal, cheaply at that. So yeah, bland and uncomfortable, you still have to use that set of three. Now this is another plastic one that is brilliant, and is good for flowers like scabious and stuff. Other than that, with some exceptions, metal is a good one to use for really neat, precise lines and shapes. So yeah, I do prefer it. You need to make sure that you don't misshapen it or rust it through mishandling. And this is another plastic one that I actually quite like. This make is good. It cuts really thin, so some plastic is better than others as well. Okay, so just before we move on to the next one, I want to say one more thing about metal cutters. Some of them, generally more expensive ones, have a tie around one side that makes it more sturdy and seemingly better quality. However, this also means that you can't flip your cutter over and just cut a mirror image of the first thing that you've cut, and that would work for peony leaves, for some foliage. So yeah, it is more sturdy, but it also disallows you some flexibility. So bear that in mind when you buy your metal cutters, that the two-sided ones could be more flexible than one-sided, sturdier ones. Another thing you might find quite useful if you make sugar flowers are scissors. You get them with bendy blades and straight blades, and watch out for the difference. If you go for a straight petal look like I did for my beginner dahlia tutorial, you see I'm using straight blades to cut little petals for the middle, but for something like orchid, in my orchid tutorial, you really need the bendy ones, not the straight ones. The next piece of equipment here is the petal dryer. It's nice and useful and neat, and the best one I found in the market by Wilton, but actually it's not essential in my opinion, because things like you could cut out a few petals, but if you have to go and get sidetracked and do something else for 2 hours elsewhere and then come back, take them out, they would have dried that little bit to make it quite tricky to impossible to actually thin them or fray them or what have you. So yeah, it's good. It has its own limitations, and it can be actually replaced by document folder of sorts. Some things to do with making sugar flowers are less obvious and yet very important. For example, if you buy veiners and cutters, it's important to measure them. It really is, because if your veiner is smaller than your cutter, then you pretty much wasted your money. So yeah, measuring tape, it's a must. Another one is a palette knife. Yes, you can use a normal knife, but it really wouldn't get you best results. Palette knife is great because sometimes you don't want to overdo on your dusting, and yet you want to pick your petals up, and it really is a must for nice flowers. Another flower gadget that many flower makers like is this little veining stick. It's good to use for a variety of flowers, in particular for veining flowers that are not individual petals, for example, you can just go around, or small filler flowers. I don't really get on with it, so I pretty much run out of things to say now. If you get very particular with your flowers, twizzers is another good gadget. You can just have one good pair with fine tip. I have loads because I keep losing them. And they're good for things like twiddling with anemones, stamens and centers of flowers, delicate things like that. For best results in making flowers out of gum paste, you would, I'm afraid, need to use wire very, very soon after starting. So it comes in different makes, but I haven't explored the difference between the makes. I'm sure there is one, but I don't know much about it. I tend to just buy from the same place and get the best deal I can. Now, and the sizes range from 16, that being really thick, to 32, being the thinnest wire. They may have been 34 as well, I'm not sure, I don't think so. So anyway, so in reverse order really, the small number is the thickest and the biggest number is the thinnest. Weird, but here goes. Why not do it the other way? Round. Anyway, excuse me. So also, in an ideal world, you would have the selection of all colors in all sizes. But I find that the sizes that I use the most of are size 20, which is the stem on which the flower head sits, and then size 26 and 28 for all the petals. See, that's the thickest one. This is how thick it is. I often use 32. It largely depends on what flowers you like to make as well. For example, filler flowers, which is just small ones and loads of them, would take a very thin wire, like a 30, 28, 30 or even 32, whereas peonies and things like that would take probably 26, especially the outer petals, larger petals. So yeah, it really depends. But if you are a beginner, I would probably suggest you buy size 20, size 26 and size 28 to start you off, all in white, because you could always color your wire to the size, to the color that you want. And also, for a neater look, you probably would cover it with tape anyway. Now this brings us to the next piece of equipment, which is flower tape. And the flower tape comes in two different widths. The thin one is better for delicate work and working with individual petals, and the thick one you use to kind of finish off the whole thing.
The thick one you could tear apart and kind of make it as 2 thin strips. So bear that in mind when you purchase. It's more flexible. It also comes in all different colors, mostly greens, whites, and a brown. And the greens come in 2 different shades. But bear that in mind that you could actually buy white tape and then color it in to go with your own colors. It's more work, but it actually guarantees you a better shade, or this is my experience anyway. To activate this tape, you need to pull it apart, and when you pull it, it activates the glue, because unless you pull it, not pull it apart, but pull it, kind of pull it apart, anyway, you know what I mean. And once you pulled it, the glue has been activated and you can get wrapping. The brown tapes is something you use for cherry blossom trees and things, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Okay, so next is pliers. For your flower work, you need something to cut your wires with, and something to make little hooks at the end of the wires. Now, this red one to the left of me, and this one here, they're 2 cheap ones, and one for each job, one for cutting and the one on the right is for hooking. However, if I was you, I would just buy one of this which does both jobs and does them nicely. It's actually a PME special one. They probably do something like this that's cheaper and not PME, and yet not really like horrible pawn shop cheap job, because they don't seem to work as well. And so now I'm going to talk about how to dry your flowers, or parts of flowers. Basically, your format could be anything and everything. You have loads of designated ones sold, which are very expensive, or you could just use spoons, which are very, very cheap. And these plastic ones come in all kinds of sizes. A teeny sizes is something that you also would sometimes use, especially if you're a bit of a perfectionist. So you adapt cheap things before you go and buy a lot of expensive things. I would say that the soup spoons are very good. I use them all the time. This, on the other hand, this Wilton Jobby, it's not my favorite because, although it looks really, really nice, I find the sizing really kind of inflexible. You have this very teeny size, which I don't personally do all that much of, or the huge size, which I also don't do all that much of either. But I do like this foamy one. I use it over and over and over again. Slightly smaller, and yet is my favorite size. You're gonna adapt it, and you make copies of it in plastic, in foil. That's a hard foil, so that's another thing. And you do a lot out of foil, up to repeating the shape of your vanies, for example. So yeah, soup spoons, foil, a couple of your favorite foamers, and you know, you're kind of good to go. See, this is kind of one of my roses, and all you do when it's not quite ready yet, you just kind of put it through, and job's a good one. So while we're on the subject of foamy things, these are the little balls. You could get them from Hobbycraft, eBay, all kinds of things, places. Some you got little holes and sometimes in them, ready to go. And you make centers for flowers out of them. Look at this huge one. You see, this would make a really good center for a big ranunculus, but if you made it out of gum paste, it would be really, really heavy, and sometimes it's a consideration when you kind of attach it to a cake. And this is another thing, it's a fake tear. Sometimes you use it if your bride and groom want a huge, ooh, look at this. This is going to be freaky. You know what it is? It's a polymer clay. I sometimes play with polymer clay, and it's just a completely different story. It really is strange, but beautiful in its own way. Might do a YouTube on it sometime anyway. So yeah, fake tear is somewhere I put my flowers in. Sometimes they're hard to stick in, so I reuse holes. But yeah, very, very good to kind of get your flowers on while you're working. Now to quickly finish, we'll talk about bits which you actually use to dry your flowers on. Now this one, you can get it cheaply on eBay. I'm not going to open it, it's too fiddly. I bought it, it was cheap and totally useless to me. I have a big oven and I use doors of oven to dry my stuff on. And this one is perfect. It's also cheap on eBay. I use it all the time. Sometimes I adapt it to make it taller, shorter, whatever. The only thing with this, you can't have your flower wire too long, so you might have to bend it sometimes to dry a flower. But yeah, brilliant. Just don't leave it where your kids could get it while you're drying flowers. So once you've cut, shaped, dried, wired your lovely flowers, it's time to add color. Before actually any of that, I tint the paste with Pro Gel and SUGARFLAIR. Those are two of my favorites. And then I use all kinds of different dusts to dust my flowers. And sunflower sugar art is one of my favorites. Now, when you do tint your paste, you really want to do it really, really slow. Do it bit by bit with toothpick or something. Don't overdo it because you're going to end up with loads of paste that has no use to anyone whatsoever. You can also mix a little bit of your dust with oil and use that self-made paste to tint your paste. That would be very good. See, use toothpick. Very, very neat. And you could just throw it away. Anyway, so if you use dust mixed with oil and then tint your toothpaste, then you could get really particular with shades and flowers and the smoothness of it all. Though bear in mind that sometimes a different background to the eventual dusting creates a nice texturous effect as well. Few times I used Americolor for tinting my paste because it does come with some really, really lovely colors. But unfortunately, I find that it just fades so quickly. And obviously, if you do it to order, it really isn't going to work, and it's really disappointing too. I have a long, interesting discussion on my Instagram page about that with different flower makers. This video seems to be going on a bit, so I'm just going to talk about dusts that are not fully edible. Edible art is a good example. They do some amazing dusts that are not fully edible, and they are very, very cheap. And the truth is that your clients would probably not eat the flowers and would probably try to keep them for memories for as long as. So sometimes, and I know for a fact that some sugar flower makers do that. They use this really bright, amazing colors that are not very, very expensive, on the condition that their customer has agreed by email, etc., not to that it's fine by them and they're not going to eat it. Because after all, we glaze it, we stick wires in them, we handle them a lot. So yeah, just one of those controversies in flower making, really, isn't it? You can use your cornflour to mix with bright colors to pale them down. Although if you want to dust directly with white, you would need to buy the manufacturer's dust. Okay, with brushes, the main thing is not to overbuy and not to buy expensive thinking they would be better. The white synthetic ones are brilliant, for example, not least because you could see the color very clearly. So if it's some residue left, you would be well advised to try to clear it off. Or they're so easily washable. They're just lovely. Obviously, they might not work for some things, like a very, very thin details, especially if you want to paint. They're good. The little, very, very thin brushes are good for them. Otherwise, medium, like this one, is a good job to start with. And this one is probably one of the main brushes in your trying to accentuate your veins on the flowers. Certain flowers like this orchid here are particularly good for that kind of thing. So watch my orchid tutorial coming out in a couple of weeks, and my anemone, never know how to pronounce this flower, here you go, tutorial coming out next week for more kind of tips on obviously how to do these things. Other than that, start with a few, use your common sense, get a feel for them, and have a little play around. I'm afraid there are no hard and fast rules about brushes that I know of. Another thing you might find useful for post-production is a glaze spray. Ignore the gold, I don't know why I included it. And a glaze spray, you need to kind of put your stuff in a box and then nicely spray it. You can have it in liquid form, and for that you would need to dilute it if you want it not very glazy. But this one, you have to spray it, dry it, see what happens, and spray it again if you want it shiny, and so on.
These here are stamens, shop bought stamens, and if you make loads of flowers, they could get quite pricey, plus they could look a little bit the samey. So there's loads of talks about what's better, these or self-made. I'm going to run a tutorial on self-made stamens at some point, so if you're interested, look out, subscribe, whatever. And yeah, so that's another bit. Use cut to size sponge to put between your petals so that your flower dries in the shape that you like. And with this, we're finally coming to the end of a very long video. So I'm really sorry, and I hope I didn't bore you to death with all this, but I just wanted to include some extra pieces of information that I think are quite useful, and hopefully you found useful too. And so I've just realized actually that I've forgotten to mention the paste, talk about missing the woods for the trees. I use Nicholas Lodge's recipe and make my own paste, and so far I've found very few flaws with it, so probably be hard pushed changing to another paste, but I am going to try platinum or what have you just for the fun of it, and see if I could gain some advantages with that for some parts of the flower or for some flowers. And I will definitely post a video on comparing the two because I love comparing mediums. So stay tuned. I hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, etc. etc. Well, I can't speak. That's it. I'm running out of words. Yes. I will see you next Thursday. Have a lovely evening. Christina Wallace here.